Welcome to another episode of the Bridging Theology Podcast, which connects scholarship to Christian life. I'm Dr. Beth Stovall.
And I'm Dr. John Stovall. We're members of the Bridging Theology hosting team, along with Drs. Candace Smith, Claudia Herrera Montero, Kevin Hill, and Ryan Reed.
Today we're really pleased to have with us Jeremy Duncan.
Jeremy is the founding pastor of Commons Church in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, one of the fastest growing church plants in Canada. He lives in Calgary with his partner Rachel, their 2 adopted kids, and their dog. Jeremy holds a Bachelor of Theology and has received his Master of Arts in Biblical and Theological Studies at Ambrose Seminary of Ambrose University. His latest book is Upside Down Apocalypse, Grounding Revelation in the Gospel of Peace, published by Herald Press in 2022.
We're really thankful, Jeremy, for you opening up the space here. And this is the first time we've ever done a live stream version of this, so we're really thankful for that.
We learned lots of things through COVID, so it's nice to be able to use those skills. So.
Absolutely. And so just so everybody knows, our conversation comes in 3 parts or 3 movements. We'll begin talking a little bit about Jeremy's scholarship, his most recent book. We'll explore how this connects to Christian life and the church, which makes a lot of sense, as Jeremy's a pastor theologian. And lastly, we're going to talk about what we call marginalia, so they're kind of the fun questions. Even though they're the questions kind of about the rest of life, sometimes people treat that almost like it's separate, but from our perspective as a podcast, we think of it as actually part of what shapes what we write, how we think, who we are. And so we're going to end off with that.
Yeah, so actually a preview of the marginalia questions will be available at the end of this episode. But the full marginalia is available to our Patreon supporters. If you would like to support the show, please subscribe, share it with others, and consider supporting us at patreon.com/bridgingtheology.
So Jeremy, welcome to the Bridging Theology Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to start with just a really open question. Tell us something about yourself that most people don't know.
Well, I did get some of the questions earlier, so I was thinking about them through. Anyone who knows me already knows this. So people in my community here at Commons are well aware of this. If you read it in the book, I even mentioned it. But things that people who haven't met me won't know is I'm a huge fan of the band Pearl Jam. So awesome. Their first album came out in 1991. So I was 13 then. Mm-hmm. So this was like the first band that I chose for myself, right? Mm-hmm. Like I wasn't listening to my dad's music, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So from 13 now to 44, I have followed them for 3 decades. I've seen them live in every city I've lived in. I have all the vinyl.
Nice.
So I've made this like a big part of my identity is being a Pearl Jam fan. So,
you know, I remember one of their lyrics where they used violence and violins, and I remember thinking, "Oh, that's awesome." So,
very good. Question for you, Jeremy. Though, so where exactly did you grow up?
Yeah.
And how has living in Calgary shaped you into who you are?
So I grew up in Ontario, outside of Toronto, in a town called Peterborough. So my parents still live there.
Oh, very good. Okay.
Rachel and I lived right in Toronto, in Scarborough, for a number of years before we came out to Calgary. But we moved here in 2004.
Okay.
So we're coming up on 20 years now in Calgary.
Yeah.
This is sort of where we've formed most of our life. Both of our kids are adopted. They're both adopted while we were here in Calgary. Mm-hmm. I started this community at Commons here. So this Ontario was where I grew up. It's where I went to high school. But Calgary's really shaped a lot of me. Mm-hmm. And I always think of Calgary this way. Growing up in Ontario, there's a lot of manufacturing jobs. You know, I worked in Oshawa for a while with the GM plant and everything. And there's a lot of that sense of, you know, you graduate high school, you do college, you get your job, you work, and then you retire. Mm-hmm. Coming to Calgary, what was really refreshing for me was there is a huge entrepreneurial spirit out here. Now, it's not always earned. A lot of it comes from the boom and bust of the oil. Yeah. But there's a sense with people that, like, you can try things, you can do things. If you fail at something, then it's fine, you just start over again. Mm-hmm. And I loved that right when I moved to Calgary. And I think it is part of why I ended up planting a church and trying some different things. So I love Calgary now. I love the mountains. I love my kids who are here from Calgary, so all that.
That's wonderful. Yeah, you know, it's interesting when we were looking at working here.
Yeah.
Initially, Calgary was the one place in Canada we thought, oh, we're never living there. And it's been really interesting to to get a flavor for what this place is and to come to love it. So
Quite a bit.
Yeah, and there's a real like work hard, play hard kind of thing. Like people work really hard, but then like the weekends are off and like you're out in the mountains or you're in the snow or you're hiking. So, and I kind of live into that. So
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually also grew up in Ontario,
Okay.
though I was pretty far from Toronto. I was people from Toronto refer to it sort of on the edge of cottage country, as they refer to it, and I always refer to it as where we live.
See, I was from the 416, so if you're from Ontario and you're from Toronto, you know the deal. Not 905.
Yeah,
we were in 416. So
Yeah, I was out in 519.
And all the
But I had that
non-Ontarians will not
similar
know what we're
experience
talking
coming
about.
out here and discovering, I really like this place.
Yeah.
It surprised me. One of the things that really surprised me was I wasn't prepared for how diverse Calgary really was.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and certainly in the 20 years I've been here, that has only changed. So when I came to Calgary 20 years ago, it was 800,000 people. It's 1.2 million now.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a drastically different scale of city than it was when I moved here. So it's been neat to see that too. So
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing with us. We're going to transition to some questions about scholarship and your vocation as a pastor theologian. So that's our next step.
Yeah. So first off, Jeremy, briefly, can you tell us about your work and what brought you to this?
yeah,
How did this
specifically
book
around
come
the
to
book
be?
and stuff.
Well, what inspired this?
Yeah, so I did my master's with Beth at Ambrose and focused on the work of René Girard. And I am a huge fan of Girard and his work on nonviolence. But one of the things I discovered in sort of looking for a thesis topic was that there's a bit of a gap in the literature around interfacing Girard's ideas with Revelation, which is interesting because Girard talks about apocalypse. It's like one of his favorite words all the time, but he's using that in a technical sense of unveiling. But it's just interesting to me that for a guy who talks about the apocalypse all the time, he never deals with the apocalypse that we have in Scripture.
Right, yeah.
And one of the interesting things is Girard is not a biblical scholar, doesn't have any background and training in that. And so there's lots of things to criticize in Girard, but one of the things is whenever he comes up against anything he doesn't like, and he's just like, forget it. He has this thing where he's just like, that's mythic thinking, it's not reflective of the Christ, just ignore it. And he does that for Revelation. He's just like, it's violent and it's mythic and just ignore it. And I thought, okay, well, what if we actually applied some biblical scholarship to Revelation and we interfaced Girard's ideas? And I actually found there was a lot of real resonance there. So that's what I started studying. Then during COVID and during the pandemic, there was a lot of to be frank, conspiracy theories and renewed interest in Revelation from a, I think, not very healthy perspective. And it's like, well, look, I've got all this research, and I work as a pastor interfacing with regular people who are asking these questions. Maybe what I could do is take some of that work, rewrite it for a general audience, and focus it. So the book at all doesn't interface directly with Girard, although those ideas come through in my writing a lot. But the book is really about grounding nonviolence, or grounding Revelation in nonviolence, grounding it in a little more scholarship to get away from some of the more conspiratorial thinking there. So it was sort of a circuitous route. Like Revelation is not really my thing. It's not like the book that I wanted to study, but I kind of came around to it, and then there was a need for it in the last couple of years. So I'm like, well, sure, I can do that.
To what degree did your process of rewriting from a thesis to a more popular level style book, how much did that come from your interaction with your congregation and your time here at Commons?
So a huge amount. So one of the things I tried to do when I first signed the deal with Herald, and they had read my thesis, and we had a sense of sort of the target audience, I actually tried to take a chapter from my thesis and start with it and rewrite it. And I gave it to my wife, and she read 2 pages, and she's like, I'm not reading this. She's like, this is not good.
It's a helpful wife, honest wife.
So she didn't, she's like, it's not interesting to me. And so I realized, okay, this is not going to be a rewrite my thesis. This is going to be a start from scratch, which ended up absolutely being the right choice. And so I went back, and I really went back to the sort of sermon voice that I use and started writing from scratch with that. only referencing my thesis to find the footnotes and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, of course, a book is a different voice than a sermon.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's sort of learning between the three different voices to find that middle ground. But I will say, you know, as a first book working with an editor, the editors at Herald were just extraordinary in terms of helping me refine that and find that voice a little bit and come out with it. And I think I got better as I go. I think I'll get better if I do more writing as well.
Yeah.
But definitely the voice in this book is much more informed by my conversations and my sermons as a pastor than it is by academic work.
Absolutely.
So.
Well, and I think that there's a gift in that in terms of you can hear it in the freshness of the voice that you have here, and the ability, how accessible it is.
Right. And you get to put some jokes in that you crossed out of my thesis for me.
Yes. Sorry, no funny in the thesis.
Yeah, actually, so I really appreciated this book, Jeremy, quite a bit.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's nice hearing, you reflecting on how the pastoral context helped to inform that, because I really appreciated the accessibility of it. And you do a number of things in this book that I thought were quite helpful, and particularly for kind of target audience of people who don't want to read a thick, heavy academic book, but would benefit from some good theology on and exegesis of the book of Revelation. Now, I'm not going to talk about everything that's in here, but I just wanted to bring up one thing that I especially enjoyed. I found that you had very interesting ways of interpreting some figures like, the beast and Babylon and, the false prophet, or, also described as, the other beast with two horns that sounds like a lamb, right? I really liked how accessible and helpful your way of doing this was. So can you tell our listeners a bit more about how you understand these figures and how you came to interpret them this way?
Yeah, so there's three figures. The beast from the land, the beast from the sea, and this woman who rides on the beast. And they represent, in my sort of reading of it, is the politics of empire, the religion that serves to reinforce the politics of empire, and then the economy of empire, and how all of those things can be in service of evil as a force in the world. And so in Revelation, evil is personified in this great red dragon, and then you get these three characters that sort of serve the dragon and carry out his will. So that's my overall picture. How I get there, without getting too technical and giving away the book, I mean, if people want to read it. But a couple things here. I mean, I think one of the things that really grounds my interpretation of Revelation is the structure. So I really think it's important to read Revelation in cycles. I think what John is doing is he's depending on the Hebrew prophets, in particular Isaiah, and he's telling the same story over and over again. So the way to read Revelation is not to map it out in a linear way on a timeline. It's to see him coming back to ideas over and over again and giving them more nuance or a different way to look at it. And at a broad strokes, he tells a story of how Christ impacts us at a personal level, in our neighborhoods and in our churches. Then he tells the story of how Christ changes our systems and structures, our governments, our empires, our politics. And then he tells the story of how Christ overcomes evil in the world. And those three characters fit in that third category when the dragon appears, and then you get these characters. And how you interpret them is complex, but there's a couple things that are important here. First of all, people really want to jump to, like, this is the Antichrist, or this is this politician, or this is that. One of the things you have to understand with Revelation is this is a particular genre called apocalypse, and that genre has different tropes, and those tropes are being used by John in particular ways. Now, we use metaphors all the time in language. One of the ones example I use in the book is this. If I said to you, the Bears destroyed the Eagles, I'm talking about football, even though that's a metaphor. And even though Bears and Eagles can represent like the US and Russia, and right now Russia's resurgent, and we're not in the Cold War, but it could be that. But like, you have couple interpretive options. You filter it through the conversation, and without any explanation, you know what I'm talking about. The problem for us is we're so far removed from the metaphors used in Revelation that if we don't do a lot of research and a lot of work, we're going to jump to really weird conclusions. Because if someone got a hold of this interview 1,000 years later and just heard me say the clip about bears defeating eagles, they might run wild with that on all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so once we really dig into these images of the beast, these images of the woman on the horse, or on the beast, you start to see resonance with images that are there in Roman literature and Roman imagery. So a couple quick examples. The woman sits on 7 hills. Well, the 7 hills of Rome is a very common image in Rome. Yeah. It's something they spoke to all the time. She has a sword and it's pointed down. That represents peace. So this is clearly, this woman's named Babylon, but she's clearly a representative of Rome. And then in the way she's described, it talks about her having all these adulteries with all these merchants, you know, her doing all these things. So this is Rome, who's in bed with, that's the metaphor, all of these merchants. And then when you read closer, what you realize is they're not merchants who are just selling products. They're merchants who are selling bodies, human bodies.
Yeah.
The language in Revelation is not even persons. It's just like they're taking bodies to market and selling them. And it's just talking about the way that economies can reduce us down to commodities and abuse us and take advantage of us.
Yeah.
And then the other really interesting example is the beast from the sea, which gets the number 666.
Yeah.
So that one gets lots of speculation.
Yeah.
But in scholarship, we have this really neat thing because textual variants give us 2 options, 666 or 616. So different textual variants. The thing is, both of those tell us this is a reference to Nero, depending on how you spell it. Kaiser Nero, Kaiser Neron. If you add those up in Gematria, you get 616, you get 666. What that tells us is the riddle was so clear to the people reading it, the scribes were changing the number based on the pronunciation they were more familiar with.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
If they would say Kaiser Neron, they would say 666. If they thought their audience was more familiar with the pronunciation Kaiser Nero, they were like, well, I'm just going to change it to 616 because people will get the reference better. Now, Nero is not the beast. The beast is, again, a reference to the politics of empire because that beast has a head that has a fatal wound, and Nero died, but there were rumors that Nero was going to come back.
Yeah.
And what John is saying here is, look, you're worried about Nero, you're worried about Domitian, you're worried about who's ever the president right now in America.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter, because if you kill them, another one will rise up and take their place, another head will be there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what we have to understand is these images were so clear to the audience that they would make adjustments in the text to make sure everyone knew what they were talking about.
Yeah.
And what we want to do sometimes is, instead of thinking about the big picture of politics, religion, economies, all of which we are a part of,
Right.
it's much easier for us to say, oh, Barack Obama is the Antichrist and we don't need him. Or Trump is, you know, the beast from the land and we need to worry about him. Instead of saying, no, we are participating in these systems right now. And that means we're implicated in the judgment that Revelation is talking about.
Yeah.
So a more thorough analysis of the images based on a little history and a little scholarship, it not only helps us exegete well, but it implicates us in what Revelation is trying to challenge us about. And that's where I think Revelation gets really interesting.
Absolutely. Well, you know, one of the things, the language of coming out of Babylon and the call to come out of Babylon and the merchants' lament at the loss of Babylon. And one of the scholars, I think it's Richard Balcom, has a conversation about the idea of like, do we locate ourselves in that lament?
Yep.
Like, are we part of the merchants who'd cry if Babylon fell? And what is Babylon, right? And so I think that there's that piece. I love that there's that the sort of local and the political and the cosmic as like big pieces of how we come to this and the ways that you've approached that.
Yeah, as soon as we turn these characters into people we can point a finger at, then we're able to sort of disabuse ourselves of any implication in what Revelation's saying. We just get to say, oh, they're the bad guy, and I figured it out.
Yeah.
When I think Revelation is much more interested in saying, hey, as a follower of Christ, what is the implication for you in the world? Where are you going to separate yourself from what's wrong? Where are you going to challenge those systems, and where are you going to create something that's better?
That connects to the subtitle that you have of your book and the idea of a gospel of peace. And something that I think is really interesting about reading Revelation as in that gospel of peace sort of framework is the relationship between suffering, which we see in different ways pictured, and the idea of hope that exists in Revelation. Could you talk a little bit more about how you see hope coming to the surface in the book? I think it's one of those books that people get real nervous about and maybe don't think of it as a hopeful book. And I feel like that's so much a part of how what you've done in your book in response.
So I think one of the things that we really need with Revelation is to, and this is the subtitle, Grounding Revelation in the Gospel of Peace, is to root what we see and what we interpret through the Jesus we encounter in the Gospels. So, yes, sometimes in your Bible, the Jesus of Revelation will be in red letters. And that's fine, but that is still a prophet's interpretation of Jesus. Now, the Gospels are not pure history. They're not objective. I understand that. You still have Gospel writers who are imposing their own memories and interpretations of Jesus on the text. But Revelation is a step removed even from that.
Yeah.
It's also a particular genre. So to hold those equally and say that Revelation equally informs the Gospels as the way the Gospels informs Revelation, I think is a mistake. Because this is such a different genre that requires such specific rules to make sense of it.
Yeah.
I think the only way we can do that is to root ourselves in at least what we can access of the historical Jesus. And so all through my book, the sort of central conceit of the book is every chapter there's a gospel reference, and I'm going back to a gospel, and I'm saying, okay, we're seeing this. Where can we find something similar in the Gospels here? So I lay out in chapter 1, I say, I'm not doing an objective reading of Revelation here. I'm doing a very specific type of reading, which is a reading through the Jesus that I met in the Gospels. And I'm trying to make sense of this apocalyptic text that I read here. Now, when you go to the question of hope, I think that becomes really important. Because there's a kind of hope that says, our hope is in God being as terrible as the bad people were to us. And that's what we hope for, retribution. That, to me, doesn't make sense of the Jesus that I meet in the Gospels, whose image and whose example is one of self-giving and nonviolence, even to the point of death. And in that, there's redemption. So to flip that and to say, well, now there's a new Jesus who's nothing like that Jesus, to me, that feels like a distortion of the Christian faith. So I absolutely think there's a lot of hope in Revelation, but I don't think it's in that Jesus is going to crush the bad guys the way the bad guys have crushed us. I think it's in the inversion of what we see as power, the inversion of what we see as winning, and the inversion of what we see as transformation and redemption. So, there's a motif or a meme that John will use where he says, I heard one thing, and I turned and I saw someone else. And I think very clearly what he's doing there is he's saying, you've heard something about God. God is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, warrior, strongman, leader. But I turned and I saw a lamb looking as if he had been slain. So you're expecting this. He's telling you what you've heard, and then he's saying, but no, it's better than this. So there's hope in that, but it's in a different kind of thing. It's not in a over and against the bad guys. It's in a reversal of the narrative and a reversal of the bad guys, and that this is how God overcomes through nonviolence and through self-giving. So the cross, I think, in John's imagination, is not the low point, it's the high point. It's the point where Rome is shown as impotent. Look, they did their worst to Jesus and it didn't stop him. Now, didn't stop him not because he comes back and crushes them the same way. Didn't stop him because love can't be stopped and grace can't be stopped and sacrifice can't be stopped. So there's huge hope. And then you go through the narrative of Revelation and it comes around to this idea of the world being transformed and the world being healed. So I think one of the linchpin verses is in Revelation 11, where you get to the end of the second cycle and it says, now the world has become the kingdom of God. And then it says, now comes the time to destroy that which destroys God's earth. So it's not, now comes the time to destroy the earth and destroy, send everybody to hell and do all that stuff. What he's saying is, in Revelation, destruction itself will be undone. You know, I used from Beverly Gaventa that phrase, you know, it's the destruction of the anti-God forces of sin and death. This is what's being undone.
Yes.
But you can't defeat death with more violence. You can't defeat sin with more sin. You have to defeat those things with self-giving love. And that's the hope that John keeps pointing us back to.
Absolutely.
Now that's harder. Right? Like it's much easier to think like the Avengers, like Tony Stark's going to show up and blow away Thanos and everything's going to be set right. But ultimately, the point isn't that the dragon is going to be killed the way the dragon killed us. Ultimately, the point is the dragon is going to be made meaningless, impotent in the world, and the world will be changed.
It reminds me of a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. From one of his books, referring to the idea that darkness cannot be destroyed by darkness. That really only love can do that, which I think is it's such a powerful piece of that sort of nonviolent way of approaching how we interact with the forces of suffering, violence, darkness in the world around us, and that our response of love is really the one thing that can undo that, which I think is just such a powerful piece of what you're saying.
I mean, just this week I was reading Judith Butler, The Force of Nonviolence, and she's talking about this idea that as soon as we stop seeing ourselves distinctly and only as individuals, but we see ourselves as a part of a collective, you start to understand how impotent violence is to fix anything. Because now, you know, if I do any violence to you, I'm injuring myself because I'm seeing us as community here. And as soon as we begin to see ourselves as community, as soon as we begin to see ourselves as part of a whole, I think the way that Jesus is inviting us to, we realize we need a better imagination for hope. We need a better imagination for how things are going to be healed. And I think that's very much what John is doing. John keeps building up our expectation, and then just at the last minute, he keeps flipping it upside down on us.
Absolutely.
And this is one of the things with Revelation is you have to read through to the end of a narrative arc. Because you can spend all your time trying to figure out, you know, what this trumpet means. But then you'll get to the end of the trumpets and John will say, it doesn't matter. None of that's going to happen. Because the way that God's purposes are going to be accomplished is through the mystery of self-giving. You know, see, you're like, oh, I just wasted a whole bunch of time trying to figure out what this image meant, and then John told me it didn't matter. Spend all this time trying to figure out, oh, how is Jesus like the Lion of the tribe of Judah? And then he tells you, nope, he's not. He's like a lamb slain. So you got to keep finding the narrative arc, find the cycle, read through to the end, and see how he's subverting your expectation. I love that part of the book.
Well, and I think something that you do really well is to read the images as a whole rather than trying to read just a piece. And I think that that's one of the gifts of trying to sort of see it as a bigger picture. You mentioned the side of, you know, thinking in community. One of the things I found really powerful is I've been working in truth and reconciliation work here in Calgary, and the more I think in terms of a community and how we impact each other, whether internally as Christians or even beyond that when we're interacting with people who are not Christians, thinking about that has deeply impacted how I think about the choices that we make and how we think about who's in and who's out. And I think that there's something really powerful about what restoration means then in light of that. So I wanted to we're going to go to our second sort of set of questions, but we've kind of already been touching on some of them anyway, which is around scholarship in relationship specifically to the church and to Christian life. And so we'll start kind of asking you some of those questions.
So again, this is something that we've already started to touch on a little bit, but I loved it so much I'm happy to come back to it. So I really appreciated how you highlighted those spheres where Revelation takes place, that local sphere and then that sort of broader political economic sphere and then the cosmic sphere. And one of the elements I really appreciate about Upside Down Apocalypse is how you point to Revelation, not just as being, you know, like about an ancient past or just about some distant future or not so whatever, but about what it means right now. So, and how that's been the case, really, for Christians all throughout history. It's always been about us now. And so I'm just want to invite you, can you share more with us now about what you think that means for Christian lives today? What does it mean to live in light of the apocalypse?
Yeah, I think
today?
So in Revelation circles, you get these sort of camps of how people read things. And, I talk in one section of the book about what I see as the problem with preterist and futurist, which are sort of opposite ends.
Yeah.
So the futurist is that John is seeing the future, and our job is to find out what he was talking about in our time.
We need a decoder ring.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And ironically, everybody seems to think that all those things are happening in their lifetime,
Of course.
regardless of when they've lived over the last
That's right.
2,000 years. But the other option is the preterist, which is, this is all about Rome. And it's about what was happening in the Roman Empire, and it's just John trying to encourage the churches at the time. And I argue that what we need is something in between, which I call a literary approach to it, which is essentially the idea that, obviously, I think, once you do the research, you realize John is using images from the Roman Empire. They're not even all that hard to piece together once you do a bit of research.
Yeah.
But I don't think John thinks Rome is the problem. And I think, the 666 and the Nero is a good example there. I don't think John thinks for a moment that Nero is coming back. I think he thinks Nero's dead. Nobody comes back from the dead other than the Lamb. But John's point is, we tell ourselves these stories, and people rise up again to take places of power, and they oppress over and over again, because that's what humans do. That's what we do to each other.
Yeah.
And that is relevant regardless of whether it's Nero in power or Domitian, who I happen to think is in power when he's writing. But even that is John essentially kind of throwing shade at Rome and saying, you guys don't matter. There'll be another empire after you, and there'll be another empire after that, and they'll make the same mistakes again. So if you're a Christian living under Rome in the first century, he is telling you, hey, keep faith. Stay on this path of nonviolence. Don't allow that to steal your imagination of what's good. Don't allow it to steal your generosity from you. Don't let it turn you insular into your community. Continue to face outward, because Rome will fade away. But that becomes a timeless message. It's one that's just as relevant when it's the church who gets into power and we're the ones oppressing people. It's just as relevant when the church is sending, colonial missionaries around the world doing terrible things. It's just as relevant today when you've got, America imposing its will on the world. You've got China, rising up in power. The whole point of the book is, when humans get power, this is what we do. We try to impose our imagination in the world on everyone, and we try to make everyone believe that the best tomorrow can bring is more of what today already has. That's what an empire wants you to believe. Is right? You can have a little bit more money than today, but you can never not be a consumer. That's what the capitalist empire wants you to believe. What John is trying to say is, don't let that squash down your imagination so much that you lose sight of the goodness and the grace of Jesus that's all around you all the time. And that means that Revelation can be a meaningful text for me as I teach through it with my community here. But I also don't have to steal it from Christians 1,000 years ago who believed it was important for them too. I don't need to say, no, you guys are wrong. It's all about the 20th century.
It's
no, it was about their time.
And us.
It was about the first century. It's about us today. And I think that is first of all, a more faithful way to the text of what John's writing, but also a way that allows me to preach it, to learn from it, without needing to center myself in history, if that makes sense. I don't need to be sort of arrogant about that I live at that moment.
We're in the moment.
Right.
No one else is in the moment but us.
We are in the moment, but so has everybody else been.
Exactly.
And 1,000 years from now, they will still be in that moment again. So that's where I think it really becomes timeless in that kind of sense. And again, when you're talking about politics, religion, economics, when are we not, as human beings, going to be wrestling with those systems and structures in our world?
I imagine that some of that has played into your preaching and kind of how you've shared these thoughts. I'd love to hear, how do you see the process of working on something like this flowing into the messages you preach when you're here at Commons?
So I think a lot of these ideas flow into a lot of my teaching, regardless of whether I'm doing Revelation. I think a lot of what Christianity has, I mean, certainly not everyone. There's certainly pockets of the church that have always maintained this. But at times, Christianity, and at times, if I'm being critical, sort of white evangelical Christianity has lost sight of this sort of social aspect of what it means to be Christian. That we are not here ever to coerce or manipulate or impose our view on anyone. But we are here to participate in a more just world, in a world that is more accessible for everyone around us. And sometimes we've very much individualized what our faith is to thinking the right things, and not so much living in a way that makes the world easier for my neighbor. And I think this brings us back to that. But specifically in teaching through Revelation, we just went through the trumpets chapter on Sunday because we're teaching through the book right now, the same way right now.
Good.
But I got to the end of and part of what I was saying is the trumpets is all of this building up of like, hey, we could do it your way. I could do all these terrible things to people, or we could do it my way, which is the mysterious power of faithful, nonviolent witness in the world that will change people's hearts. And what I talked about is, sometimes we think of Christianity as just memorizing ideas about God and not really deeply allowing the way of Jesus to inform our imagination about what is good in the world and what we're going to participate in and the ways that we're going to interact with a neighbor. And not just in convincing them of what we believe, but actually participating more faithfully in conversation, in transaction, in all of these different things, and in voting, in all of these ways. I mean, we talk about politics and stuff. I'm certainly not interested in telling people how to vote, but I am interested in saying that as a Christian, our vote should not primarily be motivated by what that will gain for us as individuals. It should be motivated by what we think is the best way to create a more just, more accessible world for all of us that live in this together. Now, we can debate about how we get there, but if that's your goal, then I think that's a Christ-like approach to being politically active in the world. If your goal is, I want lower taxes, or I want this specific policy enacted because it's good for me and a very tight circle that's around me, that's not a faithful way to participate politically as a Christian. So I think even these sort of abstract narratives have a practical theology element that comes down to what does it mean to be faithful with our world. And the other one being, when we talk about religion, we talk about those three characters. I think one of the real critiques that John is making in Revelation is that religion can very easily fall in step with the political order and can uncritically support that political order. And if our religious expressions are not constantly checking ourselves for, is this just the default politic? Or are we challenging for a different type of world? Then I think it's very easy for us to slide into something that just sort of floats with the river rather than moves counterculturally.
It's interesting.
And then we don't. I was just going to say, and at that point, we reached the spot where, without even realizing it, now we've reached the spot where, it looks like a lamb, but it sounds like a dragon.
Exactly.
Exactly.
You sound like the lamb. You're saying the good things, but you're supporting policies that are enacting violence on people. Even if you're not aware of it. And that's a really dangerous place to be. I think from a faith perspective, I think it's a really scary place to be when you're so disconnected that you are supporting violence in the world, but you don't even countenance it in your own life. That then gets really hard for Spirit to sort of get through those defenses and speak to you and soften your heart and challenge you in new ways. So.
Well, that's part of the conversation. I do work with community organizing here in Calgary, and I find this interesting space where all political people want me to be political the way they're political. And I often say to my students, being apolitical doesn't seem to me to be an option if we look at a book like Revelation. And I think that's one of the points that you're making. But also being political in only one direction without any critical thought about why you're in this direction, and is that the kingdom of God? And so one of the things I think is really important to come back to, and I love that this is a part of kind of the thinking of where you're going with it too, is ultimately the king of all kings is Jesus, not whatever political person's trying to claim through the empire, hey, I'm the great king. And so there's something about that coming back over and over again affects how we think about what it means to be political or engaged. To be able to be critical because we actually are seeking the goodness that comes from this king, who is the lamb who is slain. And so it reminds me actually of something else, a question that I have on my list, which is, something I talk about in class a lot is the idea of worship and justice, and their intertwining. And, Revelation is a book that has a lot of worship imagery in it. I would love for you to talk a little bit about how some of those worship images in Revelation, what do you think it means for how we think about worship today?
It's an interesting question. So the worship imagery, which is you're really profound and really common in Revelation, I think it's very easy to read that through our, wherever we're coming from, but for me particularly, sort of westernized version of church services, because we hear them singing songs,
right? Yeah.
And we see them raising hands, and we're like, oh, that's the music part of the service.
Right, I know where that is.
I know that, yeah, so we think of it in that context. Yeah. When in the context of an apocalypse, those moments are very politically charged. So I'll give a couple examples here. So one of them is you get these 4 living creatures, and they're super weird, and they got eyes all over and different faces and all that kind of stuff. It's one of the weirdest images in Revelation to picture. Once you get away from that, though, and you look at the literature, you realize that's one of the easiest images to make sense of, though, because that shows up all through Hebrew literature, in the Hebrew scriptures. It shows up in almost every apocalypse, because there's a lot more apocalypses than just Revelation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this idea of domesticated animal, wild animal, the eagle, which sort of represents the birds of the air and fish of the sea together, because that was sort of a category, and human. What this represents is a rightly ordered universe, worshiping rightly. And all these eyes, you're not really meant to draw this, a thing with eyes popping out all over its body. That's a meme that means they see the world clearly, right? Yeah. And because they see the world clearly, they worship the Lamb on the throne. So that's a very political image to say, hey, we can have a whole universe that's rightly ordered around the example of Jesus. That's going to have massive implications for our politics. That's going to have massive implications for what we do here and then how we live when we leave this room. And so if we equate just that to the singing part of church, and not to the rightly ordered universe that the image is pointing to, we're going to miss out on a lot. Again, another example would be one of the switcheroos that John does, where he says, after all the seals, he talks about, hey, I saw things are getting worse and worse, it's terrible. And then I saw, a righteous remnant that was saved, and it's 12,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel, so 144,000, this tiny little group that's saved. And he says, that's what I heard. That's what you've probably heard. Salvation is just squeaking through in that tiny little number. But then he says, I turned and I saw an uncountable multitude from every nation, every tribe, and all of them worshiping the Lamb. That image of worship, and they're all singing. Yes. They sing a big song there. But that image of worship is specifically about countering our imagination of salvation is for the few, and salvation is for a tightly prescribed group, the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, that's a specific critique, but that goes for any ways that we say it's our group, not the other group. Because then John tears it apart and says, nope, first of all, salvation's bigger than you think. Second of all, it's not from the groups that you think. And that's where we worship. That's where we sing together. But we sing together, and I love this, we sing together from every tribe and tongue and nation. So the song is not even one song, because it's sung in all these different languages. So it's it's an image of diversity, it's an image of coming together, it's an image of crossing boundaries, it's an image of an expansion of imagination. If we reduce that down to the singing part of our services, and we don't get the very significant political implication of a worship that does all of that, we really missed out on a lot of what John is trying to say there.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it echoes back to what we see. I mean, you mentioned that Isaiah as a structure for the book. And, in Isaiah 58 particularly, kind of re-describes what worship is in light of these practices and engagement. But I also think you get this interesting movement in Isaiah towards pushing out to the islands, pushing out to the edges. Salvation is bigger than you think. There's a critique of the internal religious powers because of the way they have aligned with the political systems of its time, of the empires, basically. And then that sense of expansion, which I think is really interesting when Revelation picks this up and sort of says, this is what worship looks like. It's bigger than you think.
Yeah.
And I think that's just really exciting.
I mean, not to harp on that, but I love that parallel. I only spend one chapter on it in the book, but I love that idea that John is a Christian who's enamored with this apocalyptic genre and tropes, but he's still rooted enough in the Hebrew tradition to know, but this is the story, is Isaiah.
That's right.
That goes from, hey, your leaders are in bed with money and you need to fix that, to the nations are going to beat their swords into plowshares, to death is going to be swallowed up. And that expansion from let's reorder our governments, to actually the nations can become peaceful, to actually the universe can be totally changed. Right. And he's like, oh, we can do that story in this genre that people are really into. Let's do it.
Absolutely.
That's a fun thing. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. Anyway, next question here was just going to be, so we touched on this a little bit, but many Christians struggle quite a bit with the book of Revelation, frankly, because of those many images of the wrath of God that we see in it, right? And in a sense, I mean, we actually do want a God who is wrathful against evil. I mean, we don't want a God who just says, that's fine about evil, and just sort of ignores it. No, God needs to be mad at evil because it's wrecking his creation, right? So we want that. But with all these images, as we already touched on, that does sometimes create a bit of a tension, because we also recognize and rejoice that God is entirely loving. So navigating that tension can be interesting. So I was wondering, can you tell us more about your process of struggling with the book of Revelation's imagery of God as both loving and wrathful, and then how all that fits together with Jesus' gospel of peace?
So one of the things I lay out at the start of the book is that I have some presuppositions when I come to Revelation. And it's this idea. First, that God is love. And second, that Jesus is the closest we will come to seeing divine love embodied in human history. So we can say God is love, but then we have to define, well, what is that love going to be? And people are always going to have different definitions. And my presupposition is that if you're a Christian, your definition for love is the person of Jesus embodied in the Gospels. So that's what I'm working with. So then I got to make sense of this violent imagery and stuff there. And what I see over and over again in the New Testament, I see it in Paul's writings, I see it in Revelation, certainly see it in Jesus, is that we see God's judgment and wrath against evil, and we shift it 1 degree to God's judgment and wrath against people who do evil. And I'm not sure that's what is being talked about in the scriptures. Because I think what we're reading about the scriptures is that people who do evil are victims of evil the same way that their victims are victims of evil. Now that doesn't mean there's not judgment for that, but it does mean that that is not the object of what God is trying to destroy in the universe. God is not trying to get the bad people. God is trying to get the bad, if that makes sense. And you see it in language like, one of the verses that comes up from Paul all the time is, God's wrath is being revealed from heaven against the godlessness and wickedness of humanity. If you read that just plainly, he's not saying the wrath is directed at humanity, at bad people. He's saying it's at our godlessness and our wickedness, everything that we do that's terrible in the world. God wants that to be destroyed. God wants that to be ended. In Revelation, John is more explicit, I think, where he says, now comes the time to destroy that which destroys God's earth. Now, what destroys God's earth? Is it human beings? Well, I think we can be agents of evil. We can be duped by evil. We can do evil things. But I don't think we actually have the power to destroy God's creation. I think it is the expressions of evil at an embodied or cosmic level. And that's what John is trying to say. Those things need to come to an end. Sin needs to come to an end. My sin, your sin, whatever that is, death needs to come to an end. And so, yes, there's judgment. Yes, there's wrath. But God's wrath is directed not at me as God's beloved creation. It is directed at the choices and the things within me that have been corrupted by the sin around me, and the systems around me and the ways that I've been implicated and participated in those things. Those things will be judged. And that may not be comfortable for me.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying, that means we all get off scot-free.
Yeah.
But the hope that I have in that is that however God judges those things, whatever God's wrath is for those things, it will be good for me ultimately because God loves me. And this is where I think it's a real problem, or at least for me, it's a mistake when we say, I hear people say this all the time, God is love. Yeah, but God is also, and I'm like, no, God is love. Therefore, God can be wrathful.
Yes.
Therefore, God can be just.
Yes.
But not God is love and wrath. God is love and just. No, God is love. Therefore, God will act certain ways in the world.
Yeah.
And those ways will be a reflection of love. So however I interpret God's wrath, however I interpret God's judgment, will always come back to, how is this an expression of God's love for me? How is this an expression of God's love for God's earth? Again, that's not always pleasant. That I don't want to equate that. And I don't want people to think I'm just saying, well, that means it's all fairies and tulips and it's all nice. But I am saying it will always be good for God's creation.
Yes.
And I think once you have that as a frame, you then interpret Revelation very differently. And again, I'm pretty clear in the book that I'm not doing an objective reading. I have presuppositions. God is love. That love is embodied in Jesus. Well, how am I going to read Revelation in light of that prolegomena? And that's what I'm finding there.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that, I mentioned that I do truth and reconciliation work, and one of the things that comes up is the tension that arises when you experience the sin you have been embroiled in, that isn't even necessarily a sin you actively are choosing, or you don't know that you're actively choosing, but you're in a system that is part of this cycle. And I think that, your discussion of Revelation and in a sense, the cycles of sin that we are in that hurt not only those who our sin hurts, but also hurts us. And so, this is something when we do training with people around, thinking about colonization, thinking about the harms Christianity has done. As a Christian, I'm having these conversations. And one of the things that I talk about is, I actually want God to put to death those things so that life can live. And I think there's something in that, in how you picture what that wrath means, because it is a loving act to put that to death, so that I can flourish while the person alongside me can also flourish. And so I think that's a really a powerful piece of what that looks like in really practical ways.
Benefiting from colonization of Canada as a settler here makes me calloused to the suffering of those who have been colonized, who've had their land stolen, who have done this. The goodness of God is the thing that will burn away that callous so that I can feel emotive towards someone, that I can experience that pain with them, then I can participate in the reconciliation of that.
Absolutely.
But the stripping away of that thing that allows me to stay distanced from it is not a comfortable thing.
No.
But that's God's love for me. That's God's goodness for me. And that plays out in so many different ways, constantly in my life. And as soon as I get through one thing, I become aware of another. And that's what, traditionally we would call that sanctification. But that's that ongoing process of, it's like, oh, now I got this thing to figure out. And now I got this thing to make sense of here.
Absolutely. I've been working on a commentary on the Minor Prophets. And when there's an entire section talking about refining fire, the purifying fire. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that we sometimes emphasize the sort of, almost like we forget maybe what it feels like for refining to happen so that beauty comes from it. The whole point is actually that the things that need to be pushed out will be pushed out so that the beauty can come, so the good can come. But the process for something that's in the fire is not a fun process. It's not like, I often think of the metal or the pot being maybe less refining. But that is actually a piece of what it looks like. And this connects maybe to my next question, which is, how have you seen this process preaching on this, studying this, thinking about this, shaping your own spiritual life?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already talked a lot about sort of the political aspects of it, so that's certainly part of it. I do think a lot of it comes to how, sort of pastoral level, I think it does radically reshape the ways that I think about what it means to journey with people that are discovering Jesus and figuring out, the implications of Jesus' message in their life. That first of all, I have very little pressure at this point in my career to rush people along in that process. I really want to be, a trustworthy guide to help them discover that thing. But then ultimately, what I want them to come to understand is that, look, if you can get this idea that God loves you completely and that God will always love you completely, then that will more slowly, but more faithfully reorient your steps in the world. So I can point out the things to you, hey, now that you're a Christian, you shouldn't do this, 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 and this, right? And that's going to put more pressure on somebody to feel like they measure up to more things, which is going to make them feel a little bit more afraid of God and a little bit more separated from God, which creates more of this kind of like defensiveness and this sort of withdrawing, which creates more sense of, I'm not sure if I'm quite loved, which creates more of this sense of, because I'm not sure I'm not loved, I actually need to be a little bit greedy so I can look after myself, and I need to be a little bit guarded with people because I'm not sure if I can be vulnerable with them. Whereas if I can start people on that process by saying, no, you're welcomed into this, you are already loved perfectly, and there's nothing you need to do, but here's what you can do, is you can slowly start to know yourself that way, and the more you know yourself that way, the less you'll need these things that you kind of do as safety nets and barriers and walls around you. You'll need those a little less and less. And your politics will be a little more oriented to the people around you. And the ways that you think about economics will be a little more generous. And then that will let you know, like that will feed into the sense of you're loved. And then that will feed into the sense of you need these, what, in the past we might identify as sin, you'll need those a little bit less. And you can kind of send people on this virtuous journey of like knowing we're a little bit more loved, needing our sin a little bit less, knowing we're a little bit loved, rather than what we often do in church, which is pointing at the bad things, which makes us feel bad, which makes us feel more distance, which makes us need the bad things even more. And this sort of sense of, hey, judgment is good for you. God is good for you. Love is good for you. Generosity, all of these things are for you because God is on your side. That can set people on a very different journey into and through Christianity. And that, I hope that comes through in everything that I do as a pastor, in sermons, but also in interactions and in the ways that I lead community.
It's something that I talk about in the story of Exodus in terms of the framing of where the law is, that obedience is a secondary motion. So the first motion is, God says, see how I carried you on eagle's wings, and out of love, right? That's the first step, God's love. And so, this is a response, right? But it's not, please just be obedient, so that maybe I'll love you.
You're chosen, and you're already chosen. So now
And so I like to encourage people to think about if we thought first about the movement of God's deep love to care for us, protect us, be with us, and then obedience flowed from that. That's a really different way of modeling what that looks like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I guess another question now for you, Jeremy. If you wanted a Christian to come away with one idea from your book, what would you want them to get out of it?
I think, so, as a big picture, which is not even at all related to the actual writing of the book, but I think what I would want people to do is center Jesus in their Christianity more than we tend to do. I think we tend to center Christianity, and I'm part of the Christian tradition. That is the narrative through which I encounter God and I encounter Jesus. But we encounter a religious scaffolding we center that more than we center the person of Jesus. And I think if we could always come back to how are we getting to know the person of Jesus who comes to us, through these Gospels, and then through that be the lens through which we read Paul, we read Revelation, we reread the Hebrew Scriptures, because I think as Christians, we reread everything through the lens of Jesus. But I think if we did that, that's really sort of at the core of what I'm trying to say in this book. And then I'm trying to flesh that out in terms of, okay, well, what if we did that in Revelation?
Yeah.
But even because honestly, do you need to understand Revelation to follow Jesus? I'm not sure you really do. I think it's an interesting book. I hope people pick it up. But that's what I would really hope people get is let's center back on Jesus. Let's keep that as our foundation, and then let's build out from there. And here's an example of how we can do that with one of the most difficult books in the Bible. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's wonderful.
Nice.
So we're now kind of in the closing section of our talk. And so we love closing out with Marginalia with a few fun questions about your life and kind of goofy questions for some of them. And so we're going to ask you a few of those until we hit like our end of streaming time. And so John, if you want to start with one of those, that'd be great.
All right, Jeremy. What is your favorite movie or film, and why?
So I don't even know how I would answer that all time, but I'll give you a couple. So this week, my favorite movie was Nope. I just watched it for Halloween.
Okay.
Jordan Peele is just a fascinating director, and the way he puts spins on sort of this horror genre. And in Nope, he does this, I won't spoil anything for anyone if you haven't seen it, but a really creative spin on the alien abduction sort of trope and stuff.
Okay.
And he is just, I think, a very fascinating director, doing some really neat stuff. In some ways, as a parallel to Revelation, where a lot of what he's doing is he's taking a trope that you know really well, and then he's flipping it upside down on you, and that's always just such a fun revelation in that. So that's one.
It's a fun revelation.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then the other one in the last year that I've seen, as far as an experience in the theater, was Dune, which just as a visual and particularly as an auditory experience, it was one of the best movies to see in the theater. I reread the trilogy this summer, and I went and saw the first film. And it's not my favorite story or anything, but it was quite a spectacle. I really enjoyed that. So there's a couple from recent.
Awesome. So, okay, if you could have an all-expense-paid trip anywhere, where'd you go?
Yeah, so I have a sister that just moved to Sydney, Australia about a year ago. So first of all, it'd be great to go see her and her kids and her partner there, but also I've never been to Australia. So I think if I could honestly go anywhere, it probably would be to do a visit to family. And it's half because I miss my sister, and it's half because I've never been to Australia.
And it's pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly.
I've heard. I haven't been there either.
So Jared McKenna, who wrote the foreword of the book, is from Australia. So I got to at least do a few Skype calls down to Australia this year. So.
Nice. I'm working on a book together with another Australian scholar, and I keep going like, so how could we arrange this? That I could come and maybe teach there or visit you. So,
and trying to find the time difference is quite the difference.
So.
Very good. All right, so if you could have coffee or tea, probably coffee, with any three historical figures excluding Jesus and Paul, who would you choose and why?
So number one would be Eddie Vedder. Every time I get a ticket to a concert, I'm always like, maybe. Like, I'll just be walking in and I'll bump into him. I'll be like, this guy's really cool, we'll be friends. I have 44 and I still have fantasies about that. So that would be one. René Girard. He died in 2015. But I have, I read most of his stuff, well, all of his stuff actually, and I would love to have a conversation with him. And then maybe a different genre. Maybe Octavia Butler. She's a writer that I really love some of her fiction. And she passed away in the 2000s somewhere. But she's a writer that I think I've read everything that she's written as well. So that would be pretty high on my list. So that.
Awesome.
It'd be interesting getting those three people together.
René Girard, Eddie Vedder, and Octavia Butler, and myself having a coffee. That would be amazing, actually.
It would be a really fascinating conversation. So, if you were asked to describe yourself in 3 words, what words would you use and why?
Man, all I want to think of is how my wife would describe me, or some of the staff that work with me here would describe me. I would say headstrong,
I didn't mean to nod on that one.
Yeah.
So I was like, yes, I've worked with him.
I'm an 8 on an Enneagram, and that's one I work. I value that in myself, but it's definitely one that I have to be aware of. So headstrong, I think optimistic. I think I am optimistic about the world, but I tend to be sort of entrepreneurial and optimistic about things that we can do. And the last one would be, I mean, maybe entrepreneurial. I love starting things. I love trying things. I love experimenting with things, and I love diving in. I love grabbing something and just like diving into it and learning everything, and then moving on to the next thing. So I love starting and trying things. So.
Do you think that's affected like your church planting and kind of that as a part of what you've done? Is because you have those qualities?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think one of the things that I have loved so much about this community in particular is that this community has been so willing to continue to evolve with me and with our staff team as it's grown and changed. I know that that's easier earlier in the lifespan of an organization, but that is the thing that has kept me, I think, as excited about community as I was starting it 8 years ago. I think if I started something and that was the end of it, I would probably stay for 4 or 5 years and move on to something new. But being part of a community that continues to change and evolve and try different things, COVID was certainly not something any of us would have asked for. But especially in the first 6 months of it, it was like, oh, look at all these new challenges. Then we figured out those challenges and it got really boring and I wanted to get back to things. But yeah, I think that definitely has moved me into that area and probably has kept me around. And then I think a part of why I tried writing a book was that's a new thing to try. Let's see if I'm good at it.
Yeah.
I think you are.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote 2 books during COVID, and I think this was the second one. I think this one was better. Like, I think I got better at it, and I think that was encouraging to me. Like, it's not that I needed to be great at something, but I needed to be like, oh, can I get better at this? Can I improve? And that's always fun. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Very good. So, what's the best compliment you've ever received?
Yeah. So, regularly, I get people who tell me I look like Jesus. And I know they mean the hair, but I choose to believe that they're talking about my character. And I know they're not, but I choose to believe that. So that's the best compliment I've got.
Wonderful.
Even though I know they're not talking about what I am.
Surprisingly, I never get the I look like Jesus. I don't know why.
Yeah, I still remember, it's probably like 10 years ago when I first grew a beard. And I had been away. I was actually, I was in Africa, and I forgot to bring a razor. And I was like, whatever, I'll just grow a beard. And then I got home and I had a beard, and I was like, I like it. I kept it. And that first day, somebody joked, and they're like, hey, you look like Jesus. And I'm like, yeah, I grew a beard recently. And they didn't laugh at it, but I thought
Nice. Actually, okay, this is really funny. I don't know if you know this. I was having a conversation with someone when I was trying to identify who you were. Yeah. And they were like, oh, the guy who looks like Jesus. Yeah. And I was like, yeah, that pastor.
Yeah, Swedish Jesus. So
just so you know, that is a widely held belief. If you could have one meal, not really for the rest of your life, but like just whenever you wanted.
Yeah.
And it had no negative effects. What would it be?
There'd be a lot. I am a vegetarian, but I would be pizza. Like, I love any pizza, but Neapolitan style pizza is like just so good. And like fresh tomatoes, fresh mozzarella, basil, that's it. I could eat that for the rest of my life. My wife and I got an Uni pizza oven this year. So we cook Neapolitan pizza in our backyard. Good. It's amazing. I would eat that every day if I could.
My daughter and I actually go to there's a Neapolitan pizza place that's like around this area. There's several of them, but there's one that we go to that's like ours, or at least how we think of it. And it's become like a special thing that we go and do as a mother-daughter.
I love it.
And it's delicious, and it's just a really fun thing to do together. So.
I've worked really hard on my double zero pizza dough. I do a Polish, and I ferment it, and I work really hard on that.
Fancy.
But you can get really good pizza dough at Lena's, just up Center Street. You can get Gruyere, you can get really good Italian tomatoes and everything. So that's
good
when I'm lazy, I just head up there, get all my ingredients, come home, make a pizza. So.
Nice.
This might turn into pizza later.
I'm kind of glad we're doing a local interview.
Yeah.
Good advice.
This is the advantage of being with someone in the same city.
Oh, well, Jeremy, thank you so much. This has been a real delight and a pleasure today. Just thanks for joining us today.
No worries. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank the listeners or watchers, I suppose, for those who are live streaming, for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you like this and you want to help us out, please feel free to share the podcast with others, subscribe on your podcast player, and consider supporting us on Patreon. So thank you so much.
Patreon.com/Bridging Theology.
And thank you to Commons Church for hosting us tonight. It was really, really fun.
Delightful.
So.
Thank you. Appreciate it so much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.